Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore Paleolithic mythology, the oldest mythology known to humanity. My guest is Bernie Taylor, who is a naturalist and an archaeoastronomer. He is the author of Biological Time and also Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. Bernie lives in the Portland area, Portland, Oregon, and now I will switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Bernie. It's a pleasure to see you today.
Jeff, thanks for having me on the program. I've been looking forward to this for years.
Well, you have done some fascinating work going into this cave in northern Spain where people have been looking at red dots and hand silhouettes for 100 years, and they haven't been able to see in the paintings and carvings on the rock things that you and people you're working with, like the great biologist George Schaller, were able to identify.
Well, thank you for the compliments, and George would appreciate that as well. But we have to remember that I'm not the artist. There were people tens of thousands of years before our time that didn't have the toys that we have. They didn't have the technology, but they were just as smart as we are.
And they put into stone, using the technology that they had, which was obviously very primitive as long as 40,000 years ago, the earliest records that human beings have made of their worldview, their mythology.
Absolutely. Not just their worldview, but their cosmic view. Their view of the sun, the moon, the stars, the animals in their world, and how they integrated with that greater cosmos, and as well as the underworld. That's important because we're now in the underworld. We're in Tartarus.
As I looked at your work, and I know it's extremely extensive, it covers everything from modern art to astronomy. One of the things that really impressed upon me is that the oldest myths of human beings must have something to do with our relationship to the continent where the human species originated, Africa.
Good. That's a good point. And we historically have believed that southeastern Africa was the point of human origin. As in, modern humans, as we would say. And the fossils dated to about 230,000 years ago, and that was really old. But about 5 years ago, there was a find at a place called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco that dated to 300,000 years ago. Rewrote all the books, everything we knew about anthropology. Where do we come from? And of course, if you look at a map, Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, is 3 hours across the Strait of Gibraltar to Europe. So I'm not saying that we came from Europe, but I'm saying that there's an integrated biosphere between West North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain. So where do we come from is a big question. It's not 230,000 years ago in Southeast Africa. Anthropologists are long beyond that subject, but it's still a tantalizing question.
Earlier in our conversation, you suggested to me that ancient humans could have swum across from Africa to Europe.
Oh, absolutely. It's a 3-hour swim. I believe that across the English Channel is like 10 hours or so in rough waters. But of course you could have swum across. In fact, if one stands at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, you can see Jebel Musa, which is a mountain that looks like a female, the Muse. Across. I mean, I haven't seen that view, but you can see the pictures, and people, it's one of the things that people talk about is, well, they can look across and they can see Africa. Animals swim across, birds, of course, flew back and forth. It's only a 3-hour swim. There's competitions how fast people can do it and how many times people can do it. And I believe the record is someone has done it back and forth 3 times.
So it would seem to me that some of the earliest heroes' journeys would be associated with that swim.
you brought up an important concept that we call the hero's journey, or Joseph Campbell called the hero's adventure. He never used the word journey, or at least not in his writing. So there's a journey, a story within us all that we take through in our lives. It may be a story that we, through adolescence, and we faced the bully, or we faced the other team, or whatever, or we, had a challenging moment in school. We all have journeys to take in our lives, obstacles to overcome, and through that, we become the more integrated self. And you've had Jungians on the program before. It's kind of the sphere. And so the hero's journey is part of who we are. At the same time, this is a hero's journey story of a person that travels from northern Spain, what is now northern Spain, down the Iberian Peninsula, swims across the Strait of Gibraltar into northern Africa, sees what he's supposed to see, and then returns back in. So we have a chronicled story of a point A to point B and back to point A again. So this is it's not just an internal hero's journey or adventure. This is also of the external world that the individual integrates with.
And we're talking about now some of the earliest modern humans, probably whose ancestors mated with Neanderthals.
Neanderthals did mate with Homo sapiens, and it is possible. There's no question that these people could have mated with Neanderthals, because Neanderthals disappeared about 40,000 years ago. These are about 34 to 36,000. So these individuals may not have, but their great-great-great-grandmothers, grandfathers could have, for sure. Absolutely. People of European descent typically have a 4% Neanderthal DNA in them. So, we have it right now.
Another thing you pointed out is that the Tuareg people, who are Berbers, currently living in the Sahara in northern Africa, that their genes have been found throughout Europe, even going as far north as Finland.
Absolutely. And I did a 23andMe test. And as the Scottish part of me, it says that you have Saharan DNA in you, which is tied to the Tuareg. So the Tuareg are an interesting people. The Tuareg have been lost in the Sahara for a very long period of time. They were insulated people, sort of fourth world people, like Native Americans were before European migrations, and people in Alaska were. So when you connect with Tuaregs, you're connecting with people from a very distant time. I have a Tuareg friend, and I'm really proud of it. And here's a kind of funny story. My daughter, when she was in high school, she was taking a French class, and she invited him in to speak to the French class about in French about the Tuareg people. And her teacher said to her, "How did you meet this person?" Because there may be only 20 or 30 Tuaregs in the United States. There's a lot of them in France, because the Greater Sahara was traditionally French-speaking as a foreign language. But yes, I have a Tuareg friend. His name is Akli. And Akli helped me a great deal with this, because he has an uncle that falls into the category of what we would call a shaman, shamanic traditions. And I would ask Akli a question, and like 2 months later, through how the camel walks, the question would come back, an answer. And he related things that were really interesting and fascinating. And he considers himself to like the last, they don't use the word shaman because they're not shaman, they're shamanic traditions, but he was sort of the last of his kind among the Tuareg in Niger. So it was a Tuareg fascinating people, and I had this unique moment to connect with them, as I still do.
This artwork that you describe very eloquently in the cave walls and the El Castillo caves in northern Spain seems to even predate the great mythological patterns that were later projected into the constellations of the sky and recorded by the Greeks.
Yes, absolutely. Or borrowed by the Greeks. In the same way that you might borrow a cup of sugar from your neighbor to bake a cake. You never actually give it back, okay? So it's an interesting concept. Well, the question then is, so we fundamentally all have our hero's journey. We have our hero's journeys as individuals, as societies, as nations. We have our journeys. And of course, we've been in crisis moments in last 2 years that test ourselves. So we have this implicit journey within ourselves. The question is there sort of an Akashic records of sorts, some sort of, that we download from, that the Greeks and ourselves download, we have this common personality, this common types. And I don't believe there is. What I believe is that the ancient Greeks and others had gone back to these caves. And they looked in the walls and they saw this imagery, and they recognized the hero's journey story, because it's a story that's within ourselves and they individually had as their own heroic adventures. And they said, boy, these people were incredibly smart. These people had fascinating adventures, and they partnered with animals. They integrated with animals such as a centaur. They battled with the lion, which is of course Leo. And then what they said was, well, we recognize some of these animals. We recognize Leo as the lion in proportion to Ursa Major as a bear, because they also had those in earlier times that they inherited from who knows where. And what they did, the same thing I did, is they said, okay, I've got these 3 animals that I know. Maybe these other ones are constellations as well. They filled in the blanks, the exact same thing as I did. And I thought, here we have the lion here, we have the horse here, we have horses of Pegasus, we have the bears of Ursa Major up here. Shouldn't there be a monster over here? And of course, there was a monk seal, which became Cetus, the constellation. And then I realized what was very important that the Greeks missed, that the Upper Paleolithic artists had, is that Orion, Hercules, Perseus, and the other great heroes are actually one hero in the Paleolithic mind. As he travels around the cosmos, this great hero, he integrates with or battles with, in the case of the lion Leo, these animals that become part of him. He picks up their essence, their spirituality along the way. And so when you look at some, imagery of, or stories of Orion Hercules, they'll have them both holding or battling a lion. But so there was originally one myth, the Paleolithic myth, that the ancient Greeks and others, they looked at it and they said, these can't be the same hero. Let's split them apart. And that created the mythology that we now credit to the ancient Greeks, that they borrowed like a cup of sugar from the Upper Paleolithic mind that they never gave credit for in that great baking of the cake.
Well, it would be understandable that these things get lost in time. And as you pointed out, for hundreds of years, archaeologists and scholars would enter these caves and wouldn't see what you and your partner, George Schaller, were able to see. And let's talk about that a little bit, because there's always the question, as you acknowledge, of pareidolia.
Absolutely. Very important question. Well, the actual, let's say, modern day archaeologists, okay? So in the last 50, 60 years or so, we actually have a record of people who had been to the caves in the last 500 years, and they saw exactly this stuff. There was a Jesuit priest, for example, who walked out of the caves and said, there's a dragon in there. And there's an animal with, like a wolf-like animal with huge teeth. And that's an important point. So people had actually gone to these caves. And they'd seen these images in the last hundreds of years. Basque people have mythology that directly relates to these caves and that they point to these caves. So there was a point in time, and we're going to say in the last 200 years or 300 years, that there was a change of psychology in the mind of European man. And I would say that's largely a change in religion. And so the Jesuit priest that wrote about this, he said that they were people who worship their dead. There's a word for that. There's a neph or something. But the people who worship their dead. Well, what he was doing, he was writing a letter to actually that ended up the desk of the king of Spain at the time and to the Pope. He was talking about a tradition that was different, that he perceived as different from the Christian tradition, that was off limits. And so these were taboo subjects. When the Romans came into the Iberian Peninsula, they didn't allow the Basque people to climb their mountains, to go into their caves, to worship these evil beings from their past, that they previously, these pagan beings. So there was a switch that turned off in the minds of people that didn't allow them to explore these concepts, write about them, and discuss them, even if they had seen them. Because Spain is a Catholic country. It's not I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's a Catholic country. And when you're speaking about, you have to keep the Spanish archaeologists, they're scientists, but they have to keep it within the realms of what the Catholic tradition could be. So they were archaeologists, they were priest archaeologists in the past. And they were the prominent ones from probably one was prominent from 1940s into the late 60s, the Abbé Brule. And he defined archaeology in Spain and France as we know it. Okay. So these are traditions, Christian traditions that people drew from. Now, you asked me about the question of pareidolia, completely different. Is that there are artists in our world today that create art based on pareidolia. And pareidolia is our unique ability among animals that allows us to put pieces together in images. So, for example, if you're looking at a mountain scene with a river in front of it, you recognize that the river is streaming along, the slope and the mountains in the background and the sky beyond that. Your mind is processing pareidolia because your mind has created a 3-dimensional, 4 or 5-dimensional, actually multiple spheres or perspectives on a flat plane. So we do this in our normal lives. When we recognize people's faces, that's in some degree pareidolia. People who have strokes some people lose the ability to recognize pareidolia. They can't recognize people in their world. It's a phenomenon. Some people have strokes, don't see pareidolia in the clouds. They don't see bunnies and bears and elephants and all these sorts of things. So it's part of our mind. And there's a sphere of what people can see in pareidolia. Some people can see, a zoo in the clouds, whereas other people see absolutely nothing or very little. So I believe that these panels were in some ways a test of the apprentice. Could they see the forest through the trees or the trees through the forest in some cases? They wanted to be able to test if you can't see that, you can't see the constellations in the night sky. You can't take the journey. You can't travel through the stars to take this great epic journey around what is now the Iberian Peninsula and sometimes into West North Africa. Because recognizing patterns in the star, recognizing Ursa Major or Leo or Hercules or Orion, that's pareidolia. When you see Orion in the sky, you have the ability to recognize pareidolia. And you think, oh, that's a man, or a human form at least. That's something unique to human beings. Chimpanzees can't do that. Okay. So yes, there is a part of us that enables us to see pareidolia, or create pareidolia in some cases that brings meaning to things for us.
Another point that you make in your book, since you brought up the question of chimpanzees, is that it's very likely the earliest human languages were like the languages of chimpanzees, sign language.
Very good, very important question. Is that we think that Paleolithic man, 30, 40,000 years ago, people for a long time have thought they are lesser beings. They can't think like we do. They don't have the intelligence, so forth. They maybe had language with a few grunts and they dragged around people, their mates, by their hair or something. And we have images of that in the movies. We have images of that. And, you can see them online. It's a totally bunk concept. And there's been, debate whether or not Paleolithic man had language or gesture language, sign language. We can go back to chimpanzees and we can see that in the wild, chimpanzees, so-called wild, chimpanzees have a gesture language. Chimpanzees have about 60 gestures that they can say, mate, come here. I'm ready to mate, I should say. Eat this. Thank you. Good job. All that sort of stuff. There's about 60 of them. And that naturally comes to chimpanzees. Now, chimpanzees in captivity have learned thousands of gestures of American Sign Language, and they've taught other chimpanzees to do that. So chimpanzees, if chimpanzees have the ability to have a gesture language, to do signs, as it were, there's no reason to believe that Paleolithic man that could create this incredible imagery in the walls did not have a gesture language. And we probably had a gesture language of some sort going back for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years before that. So we have a common ancestor with the chimpanzee. And when that line that went off, everybody Homo erectus and had the ability to have a gesture language, and perhaps even more exquisite sign language. And I've worked out a system for many animals that is expressed on the time factor, so the time of year that the animals would have events, as well as the description of the animals in those events. So they have their horns up, the antlers up, the ears down, that sort of thing. And that's consistent with people who, indigenous people around the world who create gesture or sign languages based on the animals. Well, yes, Upper Paleolithic man and women or people were highly intelligent. They made incredible art beyond what most of us could imagine someone making in modern times. And they had a gesture language that they could communicate with each other. And gesture languages are really important because we, among ourselves, have accents. We have accents within one language. We have languages that change over time. But with gesture languages, tend to be more consistent. You have a limited number of fingers. So people who had never met could, or never met someone who even had the same language group, potentially could sign with each other through a gesture language, which enables, trade and migration across greater spans of time and space.
Now, I'm going to jump around a little bit, Bernie, and the reason is that you, in your book on Before Orion, The Many Faces of the Hero, as I recall, or Finding the Face of the Hero, you use a very interesting story as sort of the archetype of a hero's journey that we can understand in modern times. And you choose as your hero the great chess player Bobby Fischer. Well, coincidentally, Bobby Fischer's brother-in-law, Russell Targ, is a good friend of mine. I've just interviewed him about a week ago. It was recently released, I should say, about a week ago. I have another interview with Russell scheduled next week. So it's very timely that we talk about the story of Bobby Fischer as it relates to these ancient Paleolithic myths that you've been exploring.
Absolutely. So Bobby Fischer, and I would say these Paleolithic artists were at the edge or the fringe of what we would call normality. So there's a bell curve, right? There's people who we call mainstream modern ordinary people that we get up in the morning, eat cereal, go to work, blank, blank, blank. Bobby Fischer wasn't like that, right? And these cave artists probably weren't either. And if we look at these people weren't shamans, but if we look at shamanic traditions and people who are drawn to be those so-called people, they typically have some sort of schizophrenia, okay, or some sort of outlying mental condition. And it's that mental condition that helps them to do the great things they do. And Bobby Fischer was clearly one of them. Bobby Fischer he believed that there were microphones all over the place listening in on him. And during it served his advantage in his chess tournament with Spassky because he walked away from the table because he thought he heard noises like in the pen and these sort of things. Okay. And his opponent was just, this is like too crazy for me. And he actually sort of freaked out or psyched out his opponent unintentionally, by this. So Bobby Fischer was on the outer edge of what we would describe as normality. And these cave artists are probably the same thing. So every person in the Upper Paleolithic probably couldn't make this art, just as everybody couldn't make it today. And everybody can't go to the level of Bobby Fischer's level of chess, just as I can for sure. Now, there's two commonalities that I believe between these Upper Paleolithic cave artists and Bobby Fischer. It's Bobby Fischer's father and as his presumed father, I should say, and his mother were mathematicians. Okay, and his presumed father was a very high-level mathematician. And when you reach that level of math, you tend to find people who are on the outer limits of normality. Okay, it's a thing. Okay, and the same thing you find with artists, that these are people that see the world differently. They have a completely different perception of reality. And so I use the Bobby Fischer example because it's a case in modern times that we see people on this spectrum. So it was Bobby Fischer mad, as some people would say, but not, or was he a genius? Is there a separation between the two? Is there truly a separation between the two? If you look at the most innovative people in the world today, listen to them, look at the works they do, and is it madness or is it genius? There's a fine line, but we are enthused and we are drawn in by both the madness and the genius. And so Bobby Fischer, I felt, was a really good example.
And it does seem as if world mythology as a whole points to a reality that, from our conventional workaday perspective, does seem like madness. For example, the idea that our consciousness extends into the heavens, that we are one with the stars.
Very good. That's a very interesting point. So Rupert Sheldrake, you may have had him on your program or could have him. Rupert Sheldrake believes in sort of this Akashic record that's all around us, and that we are actually integrated with the stars. So the question is, are we integrated with the stars? Well, we are from stardust, and of course that comes, from the physics. But do we draw from the stars? Do we draw a consciousness from the stars? Is the question that Rupert Sheldrake explores. I don't believe so. I believe that we're wired. We're wired for stories. We're wired to see we're wired fundamentally to see pareidolia. We're wired for spirituality. And all these characteristics help us to work together as a society, as well as battle with other societies. Okay. And they bring peace. They bring stability. And that was Noah Harari, wrote a brilliant book about that. So that's what I believe, and I believe we're wired for that. So we have these Paleolithic images. The ancient Greeks came and saw them, and they saw this hero on this journey. They see that the hero, merges with one animal and fights with another, being the lion. So the ancient Greeks recognize, maybe they didn't even recognize it, but what we find through the ancient Greeks is that they found stories, fundamentally, that Paleolithic cave artist stories, because people in general don't go into the so-called wild and pet lions in a cave. It doesn't happen. But people do play with dolphins, as this hero does on his journey. So they recognize that there's there's inherent abilities, that a story that they saw is fundamentally how the Greeks saw it, how Paleolithic cave artists made the stories, fundamentally how the Greeks took it back, with the exception. The Greeks were a warlike people, okay? They weren't animists. The Greeks, they planted fields, they herded goats and cattle and all this sort of stuff. Whereas the Paleolithic cave artist was one who lived with the animals, one who looked at the mother lynx and saw the tender relationship with the kitten, and saw that one could learn from that. And so the Greeks could never have seen that. The Greeks could only say, well, this person is fighting with the lynx or something like that. And in the Greek story of Orion goes around across lands and kills animals wherever he goes, which is not an animist way of seeing the world. An animist sees the world as, how do we learn from the animals? And Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, she said that her great teacher was her dog. And that was how she learned to see that animals are different, so-called human animals are different from other animal beings, and that there's a great deal to learn from. And she became an animist when she went to the Gobi forest and worked on chimpanzees. She named the chimpanzees, which was totally, off limits for biologists, but she formed personal relationships with them. And that's what she took back to us, to the world, is that the animals, beings of the forests, are just as valid as we are. they have family relationships and they have values in their own way. They dance in the rain, and they have wars, which she found as well. And so these basic human characteristics that we long believe were unique to ourselves until Jane Goodall were thought of many tens of thousands of years ago, and how people interrelated with their world as opposed to battling with the world and turning over the world with bulldozers and whatever else. And we're getting back to that point now. We had the green movement of the 60s and the 70s, and people now want to, they want to do yoga outside. Okay, we're going back to that place as part of the green movement.
I think it's worth pointing out, since you've brought up Jane Goodall, that your partner in exploring the cave art in El Castillo, George Schaller, was her mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I would say that George wasn't so much my partner, but George was my mentor too. I can tell you that one. And when Jane Goodall went into the Gobi Forest, George came shortly after. He had just written a book about mountain gorillas. And he said to her, there's two things you want to look for. One is, do they use tools? And second is, do they eat meat? Because those are two defining human characteristics that we believed at that time. And she found that, they definitely did eat meat. And they, juvenile chimpanzees killed other, let's say, other monkeys. And they used tools that they took sticks and they put them in the termite holes and, put them in their mouths, that sort of stuff. So absolutely. Now, George was my mentor in a very big way on this, and we did this all remotely. He lives in the East Coast, I think Massachusetts, but I would ask him a question. I'd hear back from him a month or two later because he was off in Afghanistan working on, a lion, the preservation of some sort of lion. So when we look at the images, I was interested in I started off interested in how are they time factored? What is it telling us about the time of year that these events are happening? I wasn't interested in astronomy, and I wasn't interested in all this psychology and so forth. And George would come back and say, it's a tender moment between the mother lynx, Iberian lynx, and her kitten. And he said he had seen such moments before in Africa where he did his field work. And I'm like, okay, that's not really what I'm asking. And then I ask him, what do you think the giraffe is doing? The giraffe. And he says, well, he's probably looking down at the mongoose. Okay. That's not what I wanted to know. Okay. And so what George was looking at was the same thing he looked at when he worked on his book of lions in the Serengeti, was the relationships between the animals themselves as opposed to our relationship, how we view the animals. And he had the same line of thought as Jane Goodall, is that they're animal beings with feelings and relationships. And that's the story. And the hero, I ultimately recognized the hero on his journey, he integrates with these animals that George recognized that are almost, except for the lion, they're all female. So he integrates meets with all these animals, female animals on his journey. And the male hero picks up the feminine traits of those animals. So that would be that would be the anima, correct?
Yes.
So he integrates it in a Jungian sense to become, so when he returns back at the end of his journey, all these animals, all these female animals are part of his garb and part of his self. So he then becomes the fully integrated male who recognizes both his masculinity, because he fights and slays the lion, but also that he needed all the females on his journey. So what did the ancient Greeks do? Well, the ancient Greeks substituted all those female animals for female forms that helped the heroes on their journey. And in some cases, the female forms could transform into an animal to help the hero, or at least give the hero some sort of amulet, something of themselves to help the hero to slay the lion or fight the dragon, that sort of stuff. And so not only did these upper life artists understand or comprehend, the cosmos and that these were animals, and that's a mother and the child, but they recognized very deep Jungian psychology that we're still coming to grasp with today. Because Jung was an extraordinary genius, and he had concepts that instead of saying what it was, he would write an entire book about these are examples of this is what it is. And so that is part of this journey we're still taking of learning to recognize young. But they understood it 34,000 years ago, and they integrated it into their hero's journey myth adventure with the integration of the female who assists the adolescent hero on his journey.
Well, another important aspect, I think, of the Jungian journey, the Jungian version of the hero's journey, shall we say, is the idea of the confrontation with the self, the journey inside. And as I understand it, you relate that both to the heroic journey of Bobby Fischer and to the Paleolithic art that you've explored.
Absolutely. In the Bobby Fischer case, he had trouble getting out of bed. Okay. And he was afraid of all these demons that were ultimately in his head, such as, thinking that the pen was was recording him. And Bobby Fischer had to face the fear of his demon was himself. And he ultimately had to face his own demon to rise to the level and beat his Spassky to take the world championship. So in this Paleolithic journey, we find the hero actually faces himself. So the constellations or characters of Perseus and Orion, they face off. They look at each other in the eye, and they one is punching, the other has got his arm up with a club. And these two characters are actually in a different time and place. As we know, Orion and Perseus are in the night sky. But they battle with each other. So the hero has come to this moment that he's in a crisis moment, that he battles with himself. And after that crisis moment, he comes to battle the lion, which is of course Leo, as I've said. And the lion is the only animal that he slays on his journey. And he takes the pelt of the animal that puts around his neck. So yes, the hero comes to face himself in the Jungian sense. Now, Joseph Campbell, okay, I'm going to start off. I'm a fan of Joseph Campbell, okay? But I'm also a critic of Joseph Campbell. One of the things that Joseph Campbell said he was completely right about was that the hero on his journey picks up or integrates with the female forms. And he comes back to be the more integrated man. Now, people say that's sexist. No, it's not sexist because it is what it is. And that's what happened this Paleolithic journey, what's happened for, tens of, who knows how many millions of years. Now, what Joseph Campbell also said, so Joseph Campbell's right about that. What he also said is that when we come to face the dragon, that is the dragon within ourselves. I'll give that for the lion, but not for the dragon, because the dragon we actually have Draco in the constellation in the right place as a crocodile, a very large crocodile. The dragon is actually protecting an egg, or the crocodile that becomes the dragon in mythology is protecting an egg that the hero is trying to steal. Okay. So is the hero afraid of the crocodile? Absolutely not. The hero is trying to steal the crocodile's egg. Okay. So this original, that's a sort of a reimagining of the story as the ancient Greeks and people came in modern times of the hero facing the dragon, which is the demon and that sort of stuff, which goes back to the St. George and the dragon myth as well. So the original dragon comes 34,000 years ago, that we have, that became the constellation Draco and was being preyed upon, this mother crocodile, by the hero. And it's not about facing the dragon in the cave and all what Joseph Campbell proposed and one often reads.
Well, since you bring up the dragon myth, the oldest dragon story of which I'm aware comes from Sumeria, and it's part of the creation story of Sumeria, where the dragon is also a great female goddess, Tiamat, and the god Marduk comes and slays the dragon, and out of her belly, he cuts open her belly, and out of her belly, the universe emerges. That's the act of creation.
Yes. So very interesting. And there's an overlapping of the Paleolithic story. So the ancient Mesopotamians had a source, and this was their source. So I said that the hero tries to steal the egg from the crocodile, and the crocodile holds the egg in its mouth. Okay. That is the 11th, the last minute of the 12th hour of this story, or the 24th hour of this journey. Because in that 24th hour, he returns to be this integrated self, and he's holding the egg. Okay. He's holding the egg in his right hand. And what's interesting is that in the image, he's holding the egg, but the crocodile hasn't released the egg from its clutches, its jaws. So he's holding the egg with the crocodile dangling down from the egg. Okay. Which is kind of an interesting piece of it. So what is he? So that egg becomes, from my read on it, it's the cosmic egg. Okay. And that, which goes cosmic egg from which all life sprang in, effectively the Big Bang story. Okay. That's what it is. Okay. It's the singularity. And this mythology of the ancient Mesopotamians goes directly to this, because that is the origin of creation. As people later came to interpret it. But that's not, I'm going to tell you, that is not the origin, not the Paleolithic. Cave artists interpreted it as. They didn't see it as a cosmic egg. What they saw it as one integrated image of all these constellations, all these characters that overlap with each other, that then sprang forth into the cosmos. But not from an egg, but from a mountain. From a cosmic mountain. That was their mythology. Their mythology was that the integration between the earth, the terrestrial plane that we stand on, and the sky world was a cosmic mountain. And that all these characters had once been in this mountain, and then they sprung from the mountain, they broke free from the mountain, and that became the cosmos in the night sky. It also became the terrestrial cosmos, because these are all animals in their world, as well as in the underworld, Tartarus. So we think of, you can look at the world tree, of course, where the branches reach the sky, the stem, I guess the base of the tree is where we stand, the terrestrial world, and the underworld are those roots into the ground, which is, of course, a metaphor that we use, that they definitely used it, and we use it as well, and that everything is connected in their cosmic view. This pareidolia cosmic view, where they can find in the stars all these constellations, these animals, and where we can find them too through the depths of our pareidolia imagination.
You also bring up the origin of beings that are known in virtually every culture. We think of them as angels. It's the integration of the human with the bird, and it goes back, I suppose, to the earliest shamanic traditions as well, where you see the use of feathers in various shamanic rituals.
Absolutely. We can travel around the world and throughout time. We can find people who put feathers in their hair as ceremonially to have that flight to reach to the great beyond. That's the essence of the story. So the bird, whether it be an actual bird or a feather of a bird, so the actual bird be horse in the Egyptian tradition, right? Or Zeus transformed himself into the bird Agalar to come down to earth. So whether it's an actual bird or it's a feather of a bird, the bird becomes the intermediary between the great beyond. So there is a time before airplanes and spaceships where we couldn't travel very high. And the only way that we can do it was either climb a mountain or in essence become integrated with the bird. And we find this bird tradition, this bird ceremonial tradition throughout the world. We find it in North America among Native Americans, and everybody obviously thinks of the Native American headdress and the dancers and so forth. Well, that tradition, Native Americans came across from Beringia, across Strait, now the Bering Strait, 15 to 20,000 years ago. Actually came across, but they came down at a later time period. And we find the same traditions in what we now call Siberia. And so these traditions the Native Americans did not invent these traditions, but the validation of them in that they have their own forms of the traditions. So the Lakota Sioux and the Iroquois had a different dance and they used different language. But fundamentally, it was this transcendence. So we can travel around the world, go back tens of thousands of years, and we can find these images of the man, because they're all men in these cases, integrating with the bird. And in every case, you can see the face, you can see the lower part of the face, the nose and the mouth of the man. So the artist is very careful to show that the man integrates and draws strength from the birds, but the man does not become the bird. Okay? So that through the putting on the mask and putting on the feather dress, one can then transcend to the great beyond. One does not become a bird itself. And so if we think about angels, or this avianoid tradition, the angels, in Abrahamic tradition, is the intermediary between the great Almighty, God, and the human. And so, Mary, mother of Jesus, was visited by an angel. Muhammad was visited by an angel. You can just go down the list and you find the angel Gabriel. And actually, Muhammad was actually tutored by the angel Gabriel, not just met the angel Gabriel. And so what we're finding is that there's something inside of us, this animism, this belief that we can integrate with animals to go to other places. And we still do today. You may have said someone is, smart as an owl or strong as an ox, fast as a stallion, swift as a cheetah, all these sort of things. But we're not as fast as a cheetah. We're not as strong as an ox. And we're certainly smarter than an owl. So we retain these animistic traditions in the case of the angel within us. Now, people will say, well, that's just, mumbo jumbo, spirituality, religious stuff. But it goes beyond that. If you go to the theater to see Marvel movie, and DC Comics, you're going to see the integration through Spider-Man and Batman and Aquaman, and you just go down the list. So there's something in us that we can look at a movie and see a man transform into a spider. And we believe it. We fundamentally believe that genius and that madness can actually happen. So it's something that's integral to who we are as a species. We don't see chimpanzees dancing like birds, and we don't see them, leaping like leopards and all these sort of things. This is part of that fundamental, not visual pareidolia, perhaps a mental pareidolia in our imagination that makes us uniquely human.
One of the other major themes that you've been alluding to has to do with the relationships between the genders. And I know you've talked about the role of the male, particularly with regard to the avianoid merging. But there's also an important role for females that you've found in the Paleolithic art.
Absolutely. So the hero on the journey is clearly, because I have a few panels with the same imagery, they're men, and that's okay. But as I said earlier, the hero can't complete his journey, can't become the integrated self unless he picks up and learns from the female characters along the way. And there's a lot more female characters than there's male characters. There's actually on this gallery of discs at the Castillo Cave, there are two female characters. One of them is a pregnant woman who doesn't look very happy, and above her head is the origin of Medusa. Okay, so it's a woman, and she's missing one eye. And I actually don't do that. I have it in the book, but I don't talk about that in presentations because I haven't. That's like nuances. And the Medusa character has her mouth; she's talking, and the younger female woman is not talking. She's just not happy at all. So we do have two female characters, female human characters, and it shows a dominance of the older female who's doing all the talking without any question about this. In fact, she is the only character on any of these panels that actually talks. So she's giving her perspective on how things should be. So there's these images, the Paleolithic cave artists fully appreciated that there's a female presence, and they, both among other animal beings and human animal beings, and that I believe they're actually matriarchal societies. And she's doing all the talking, and she's very clear, I can't see her words, but she's very clear that she is to be heard. But the Greeks, ancient Greeks, took her as Medusa. So there's a change of psychology there, that they saw the woman, this domineering woman, that's kind of older woman, slightly monstrous in a way in how it was depicted. Okay, she's got one tooth and sort of stuff, but they took her as a monstrous woman because that was the mindset of the ancient Greeks, which is a different mindset of I believe of the Upper Paleolithic cave artists. We can take archetypal characters. We can take the older woman as the wise woman, the matriarch, the leader of the clan, or we can change her into the monster. So an archetype can go different ways, but we still recognize her as a dominant figure.
We tend to think of Western culture as having originated with the ancient Greeks, but what you're suggesting here is that the ancient Greeks inherited much, much older traditions from prehistory, and then because of their own situation, they distorted those older traditions.
Yeah, they changed it to their worldview, just as we do today, and the centaur, for example, the major centaur is, got to give me a name on this one, who helps all the heroes. He's male, but this centaur, the horse that the man integrates with on this journey is female. Okay, so the Greeks they in their worldview, you couldn't have a male horse running the show to teach all these male heroes how to be great at war.
You mean you couldn't have a female horse?
I'm sorry, you couldn't have a female. You couldn't have the female. Exactly correct. Thank you. And it's a different world perspective. But in that world perspective of the ancient Greeks would have been pretty close to 200 years ago, before the female emancipation in this country and in other parts of the world. And so today, if you look at a Disney movie, most of the heroes are young or adolescent girls, and females. So we have a shift in psychology to not just promote what had been lost before, but rather we're rewriting the story itself.
So, in other words, the mythology is constantly evolving.
Yes, the mythology is constantly evolving. That's a good point.
Well, one of the other themes that is there in virtually all mythology around the world, we barely touched on it today, has to do with the underworld, the realm of the dead, and the idea that the dead, our ancestors, are still with us.
Absolutely. So I said earlier that the Jesuit priest went into the caves and he came out. He said that they're worshiping their dead. That's what he said. But in the Upper Paleolithic mind, they weren't worshiping their dead. They were integrating the underworld with the terrestrial world to the sky world. Okay. So where does this all come from? Where does all these ancient traditions of the dead and the underworld come from? I believe this Upper Paleolithic source is that people had gone to these caves and they had seen these characters, and so these obviously dead people because they're not alive now, and they walked away and said this became the world of the dead. Now the world of, and this is not a hell by any stretch of the imagination. And what we think of the ancient Greeks came up as Tartarus, they came up this horrible world at Cosmos, and then later it became the underworld of, another word for underworld, where the Cerberus was. And by the way, you can actually, in one of these cave panels, you can see the Cerberus. And what the Cerberus is an overlapping of 3 dogs. And so that it looks like there's a 3-headed dog, but in fact, they're 3 dogs and one of them is a puppy. Okay. But, the ancient Greeks and others had walked away and they found this world of the dead that really wasn't there, but it's a world that they wanted to find. So it wasn't something it was their perspective on their cosmic view. So don't worry for the listeners out there. There's no underworld, land of the dead. It may be somewhere else, but it's certainly not in the underworld.
Well, Bernie Taylor, this has been a fascinating exploration. You really ventured into places that few people have ventured, and it's an eye-opener for me. I think it'll be a real eye-opener for our viewers as well. I want to thank you very much for being with me today.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. I'd love to do a program another time, explore some of these subjects more deeply. These subjects that are at the core of who we are. They're about our existence and our cosmic view. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.